The sun over forward operating base Kestrel did not merely shine, it pressed. It bore down across the sand flats like a flat palm against the back of the neck, unrelenting, indifferent, and by 11 in the morning it had already turned the air above the tarmac into a trembling, liquid haze. The thermometer bolted to the side of the motor pool shed read 43 degrees Celsius. Nobody looked at it anymore. Looking at it did nothing. Sergeant Dale Mercer had been at Kestrel for 11 months. He knew exactly how the heat moved through the day, how it crept up through the floor of the barracks before dawn, how it peaked around 2 in the afternoon in a way that made your thoughts slow and thick, and how it released only enough in the evening to remind you that you could sweat in a new direction. He knew everything about this place. He knew the way the wind changed before a sandstorm. He knew which bunks caught the cross breeze from the ventilation seam in the east wall. He knew exactly which men in his unit were worth something in a firefight and which ones would fold. What he did not know, when the transport rolled in on a Tuesday morning in late July, was what to make of the figure who stepped off at last. She was slight. That was the first word that came to mind, slight, and it sat wrong against every other thing in this landscape. Everything at Kestrel was thick and heavy and loud. The walls were thick. The air was heavy. The men were loud. She was none of those things. She came off the transport carrying her gear the way someone carries a grocery bag. Without ceremony, without display, without the kind of deliberate squareness that new soldiers sometimes performed to show they were serious. She didn't need to show anything. She simply stepped down onto the sand and looked around, and her eyes moved across the base the way a surveyor's eyes move across a plot of land, not admiring, not reacting, just measuring. Corporal Trey Whitfield nudged Mercer with his elbow. "That one supposed to be with us?" Mercer looked at the manifest clipped to his board. The name was there. Vasquez Elena, Specialist. He looked up at her again. Apparently. The men unloaded. She unloaded with them. She asked for nothing. She was shown to her bunk, the last open one, in the far corner of the eastern barracks, next to the wall that leaked dust when the wind ran east, and she took it without comment. She set her bag down on the floor beside it. She sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed it twice with the flat of her hand, testing the springs. Then she stood, opened her bag, pulled out her single blanket, and began to make the bed. Mercer was still writing the manifest when he heard Whitfield laugh. He looked up. Elena Vasquez was folding the corners of her blanket with the kind of precision that belonged in a different world entirely, a world with inspection-grade lighting and mitered edges and officers who carried rulers. She was folding it in the middle of a forward operating base where the floor was sand-packed concrete and the ceiling was corrugated metal, and 3 other men in the room still hadn't unpacked their bags. The corners of her blanket were sharp. The surface was flat. The fold at the foot of the bed sat at a perfect 90 degrees. "Hey," Whitfield said. He was grinning. He nudged the man beside him, Private First Class Owen Rourke, a broad-shouldered 23-year-old from North Carolina who hadn't smiled less than 5 times in a row since arriving. Hey, look at this." Others looked. The laughter spread in the low, easy way that group ridicule spreads not all at once but rippling, one face to the next. "What is this?" Whitfield said. "Is this a hotel? Did I walk into a hotel?" Rourke braced his hands on his knees and leaned forward with theatrical appreciation. "Ma'am, I think your towel swans are in the other room." More laughter. Mercer didn't join in, but he didn't stop it either. He watched Elena. She did not look up. Her hands continued their work. She smoothed the surface of the blanket once, twice, a third time, not because it needed smoothing, but because each pass of her palm was part of the sequence, and she was completing the sequence. Then she straightened, turned, and bent down to unpack the rest of her bag. "Hey," Whitfield said again. "I'm talking to you." She glanced at him. Just once. The kind of glance that registers a sound source and categorizes it as non-threatening. Then she went back to unpacking. Whitfield looked at the others. He was still smiling, but there was something new in the smile now, a faint edge of confusion, because being ignored is a different thing than being dismissed, and she had done both simultaneously and without visible effort. "This isn't a hotel," he said, louder this time. "In case you weren't clear on that." Elena set a small toiletry bag on the shelf above her bunk, aligned it with the edge, set her canteen beside it, aligned that too. "I know," she said. Not angry, not apologetic. The way you'd say "I know" to someone who had just told you the sun was hot. Whitfield opened his mouth, closed it. The laughter around him had gone a degree quieter, the way laughter does when the target refuses to behave like a target. Mercer looked back down at his manifest and finished writing. But he kept seeing, in his peripheral vision, the way she had looked at the room when she stepped off the transport. that surveyor's gaze, level and unhurried. He filed the image away and told himself it meant nothing. 3 days passed, and then 4, and then a week. Elena Vasquez did her assigned work. She ran logistics support inventory, supply chain coordination, the unglamorous infrastructure of a fighting unit. She was not assigned a combat role. She carried her sidearm in the standard configuration, no different from any support specialist. She ate when others ate. She slept when others slept. She was, in every bureaucratic and functional sense, unremarkable. And yet, Private First Class Nathan Goss noticed it first, though he wouldn't have been able to articulate what it was. Goss was 20 years old, and observant in the way that young people sometimes are before the world teaches them to look away, genuinely curious about what other human beings were doing and why. He was the one who, on the 5th morning, tracked the fact that Elena had cleaned her sidearm twice before breakfast when the standard protocol called for weekly cleaning. He mentioned it to Rourke. Rourke shrugged. Goss kept watching. It wasn't only the cleaning, it was the way she cleaned. The movements were not perfunctory. They were not the movements of someone following a checklist. They were the movements of someone who knew the object in question so thoroughly that maintenance had become indistinguishable from communion. Each component came apart and went back together with the same smooth, automatic certainty, the same unhesitating rhythm that surgeons develop for procedures they have performed 10,000 times. Goss mentioned this to no one else. Instead, he watched the other thing. Her eyes. Elena Vasquez never appeared to be looking at any particular thing. She looked at the general landscape, the base, the perimeter, the sand flats beyond the wire. But whenever she was still, which was often, there was a quality to her stillness that Goss could not name accurately. It was not vacancy. It was the opposite of vacancy. It was the stillness of a system in full operation, processing, calculating, filing results while the external surface remained inert. He noticed that her gaze, when it rested on the far ridgeline, held for specific intervals, not wandering, not scanning, holding, as though she were taking readings. On the 8th day, Whitfield tried again. He'd been drinking water outside the motor pool when Elena came around the corner of the equipment bay, and on impulse or perhaps out of lingering wounded pride, he pulled off his patrol cap and flicked it forward with a spinner's wrist. It landed in the sand, perhaps 6 meters ahead of her, and to the left, dropped with a soft thud and a small cloud of dust. "Little help," he said. She was perhaps 10 paces from the cap. She altered her course slightly, not toward the cap's location, but toward a point that intersected with her original path and required no additional steps, bent smoothly, retrieved it, and placed it on the equipment bay railing at a height consistent with where a hand could reach it naturally. Whitfield stared at where she'd placed it. He had thrown the cap without calculation. She had retrieved it with what appeared to be mathematical precision. He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands. He looked at the distance from his original position to the railing. He didn't say anything. Goss, who had been watching from the shade of the far wall, wrote nothing down. He simply updated the file he was building in his head. The file was unlabeled because he had no name for what he was observing. He only knew that it was something. Mercer noticed a different thing. He noticed that in 8 days of operating in temperatures that averaged 40 degrees, Elena had not once complained of the heat. He noticed that during the 2-kilometer physical assessment run that all support personnel were required to complete on arrival, she had finished in the 2nd tier, not the fastest, not conspicuous, but solid. He noticed that she had finished slightly behind a pace that, if she had maintained it, would have put her in the top 10%. She had not maintained it. He wasn't sure why that bothered him. Colonel Richard Holt arrived at FOB Kestrel on the 12th day without advance notice, which was his preference. He believed that announced inspections measured preparation. Unannounced inspections measured character. He was 51 years old, compact and precise, with close-cropped gray hair and the kind of face that had been trained out of all unnecessary expression. He had commanded men in 4 different theaters of operation. He had written the field operations manual that was currently used by 3 allied nations. He did not like waste of any kind, not of resources, not of time, not of human potential, and he could identify it from a considerable distance. He walked the eastern barracks at 0730. He moved without ceremony, hands behind his back, eyes moving in their efficient, practiced way across every surface, every piece of kit, every face. His aide followed 2 steps behind and said nothing, because Colonel Holt had told him on his first day that unsolicited commentary was a form of noise. He was nearly at the end of the barracks when his peripheral vision registered the corner bunk. He stopped, not sharply, not dramatically. He simply stopped walking, the way a man stops walking when something requires a second look, and he looked. The bunk in the corner was made with a precision he had not seen outside of formal inspection conditions. The blanket was flat, the corners mitered to exactly 45 degrees, the pillow seated at a consistent angle to the headboard. It was not merely neat. It was deliberate in a way that went past neatness into something else, into the territory of habit so deeply ingrained it operated below the level of conscious choice. The woman sitting on the bunk beside it, the owner, he inferred, was not making her bed. She was doing something else. She had her sidearm disassembled on a cloth spread across her thighs, and she was running a bore brush through the barrel with the calm inward focus of someone engaged in a private ritual. Holt's gaze moved from the blanket to the weapon. He looked at where the disassembled components were laid. There was a precision in their arrangement, each piece at a specific angle, a specific distance from the next, in an order that was not merely functional but optimized. The recoil spring was angled slightly to the left of parallel. The barrel was perpendicular to the edge of the cloth. The slide was seated exactly 3 inches from the frame. He had seen this layout before. Once. A decade ago, in a briefing room in a building that didn't officially exist, he had seen a training photograph pinned to a corkboard above a line of text that read, "Field Maintenance Protocol Advanced Precision." The protocol was associated with a program that had been classified, then quietly discontinued, then classified again under a different name. He stood and continued watching. She had not looked up. She was finishing the bore brush pass. Her movements were the same movements, the exact same grip angle, the same rotational speed as the movements in the photograph. Holt looked away. He continued down the row, examined 2 more bunks, spoke briefly with a lance corporal about boot condition. He walked to the end of the barracks. He turned around. On the return pass, he stopped again. She was reassembling the weapon now. She set the barrel back into the slide with a smooth, pressing motion, eased the recoil spring into place, and brought the slide back onto the frame in a single, fluid rearward push. She did not look at her hands. She was looking at the far wall. Her hands knew what they were doing without supervision. Holt's aide, hovering nearby, opened his mouth. Holt held up 2 fingers without turning. The aide closed his mouth. For a moment that lasted longer than it appeared to, Holt simply observed. He observed the hands. He observed the eyes. He observed the particular quality of composure, not the aggressive composure of someone suppressing nerves, but the deep, structural composure of someone for whom stillness is the default state and agitation would be the anomaly. He did not speak to her. He walked out of the barracks and into the white, pressing heat of the morning. But his aide noticed, in the colonel's face, a shift so minor that only someone trained in watching for it would have caught it. Not surprise. Something more controlled than surprise. Something more purposeful. Recognition. The range exercise was announced that afternoon. Colonel Holt framed it as routine evaluation all personnel, full unit, distance marksmanship assessment at the Eastern Range. Standard procedure for a visiting command officer. Nobody questioned it. The targets were set at 300 meters, 400, and 500. The wind off the desert flats was running at 20 to 25 kilometers per hour from the northwest, variable, the kind of wind that made distance shooting a negotiation rather than a calculation. The heat shimmer above the sand created an additional visual distortion that added a layer of difficulty at the longer ranges. The men went in rotation. Most were solid at 300, a few were solid at 400. At 500, with the wind moving the way it was, accuracy dropped sharply. Rourke, who was the unit's designated marksman and had a legitimate pride in his shooting, put 2 of 5 rounds on the 500-meter plate and called it a decent effort given the conditions. Mercer agreed privately that it was. Elena was near the end of the rotation. Her name was on the evaluation list. All support specialists were required to complete the baseline assessment, and Mercer watched her approach the line with the same loose, unhurried economy of motion she brought to everything. She looked at the 300-meter target. She looked at the 4 to 100. She looked at the 5 to 100. She did this in a slow, methodical sequence, and Mercer noticed that she was not looking at the targets themselves but at the air between the targets and the line at the distortion layers, at the grass tufts to either side that were indicating wind direction, at the angle of light on the sand. She picked up the rifle. Her stance was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not the wrong of someone who had never held a rifle, but subtly wrong. The elbow angle too open, the grip slightly overextended. Small things, the kind of things a shooter develops bad habits around and doesn't bother to correct at the baseline level. She fired 5 rounds at the 300-meter target. 3 hits, 2 misses. Whitfield, standing 2 positions to her left, made a sound in his throat that was not quite a laugh, and not quite a word, just an exhalation that carried a specific meaning. She fired at the 4 to 100. 2 hits. At the 5 to 100 she shifted position. Reset. She was at the line for 7 seconds. Then she fired twice, and both rounds went wide. The range sergeant called scores. He wrote them down. Whitfield was smiling again. It was the recovered smile, the one that comes back after it's been displaced. At least she makes a good bed, he said, not loudly, but audible. 2 or 3 men near him acknowledged this. Holt was standing 30 meters back from the firing line, behind the assessment station, his hands still behind his back. His aide was beside him with a clipboard. The aide had noted the scores. Holt said nothing about the scores. What he said, quietly, to no one in particular, was, "She pulled left on every shot." His aide looked at the scoring sheet. He looked at the target results. He looked at the notations. "The wind was," he began. "The wind was from the northwest," Holt said. "Consistent deflection would have pulled right. She pulled left on all 7 hits. Consistently. Same distance each time." His aide did not say anything, because he was not sure what he was being told. Holt looked at where Elena was returning the rifle to the armory runner. Her movements had returned to their default state, clean, unremarkable, precise. She was correcting for a wind pattern, Holt said. The wrong wind pattern. Deliberately. He turned away from the range. "Pull her service record," he said. "All versions." The contact report came in at 16:10 that afternoon. A reconnaissance element 2 kilometers northeast of the base perimeter had identified a hostile sniper team established in the rocky high ground above the dry riverbed. The team had positioned in a blind that was partially sheltered by an overhang of sandstone, a naturally screened position that would be nearly invisible to thermal at this hour, and entirely invisible to standard optics at the relevant distance. The distance was 1,100 meters. Mercer received the report and did the arithmetic without wanting to. His unit's designated marksmen could work reliably to 700, maybe 750 in ideal conditions. Current conditions were not ideal. The wind had shifted to the southeast since noon, and was now running faster 30 kilometers per hour in gusts, and the light was coming from a low angle that created shadow interference in the upper half of the visible field. At 1,100 meters, in these conditions, with available assets, the math didn't work. The first shot came from the ridge at 1,623. Private First Class Aaron Keene was crossing the open ground between the equipment bay and the water station when the round hit the sand 3 feet to his right. He went flat and started crawling, and the radio came alive immediately. 2 more rounds in the next 90 seconds, warning shots, or ranging shots, the distinction mattering less than the fact of them. The unit organized under fire the way it had trained. Mercer coordinated positions. Rourke set up at the eastern gun port and assessed the ridgeline through his scope, and reported that he could see the muzzle flash position, but that at this range, this light, this wind, he could not guarantee a first-round hit. He said he could try. Mercer said to hold. At 1,634, a round came through the northern slit opening and caught Sergeant First Class Patrick Dunn in the right shoulder. Dunn went down without a sound, which was somehow worse than if he'd made noise, and the medic covered the distance to him in 4 seconds, and was working before anyone else had processed what had happened. Elena was against the eastern wall, 10 feet from the medic and Dunn, when it happened. Mercer saw the moment she registered it. Her face did not change in any demonstrable way, but something in her body did a single, almost undetectable tightening, like a system receiving a signal it hadn't been waiting for. She was looking at Dunn. Dunn was conscious. He was looking at the ceiling. He was not moving his right arm. Holt crossed the room in that particular way, that very senior officers sometimes cross rooms under fire, not running, not strolling, somewhere in between, with a calm that is not the absence of urgency but the management of it. He stopped 3 feet from Elena. She did not look at him. He waited. Another round came in, struck the outside of the eastern wall, raised dust. "Vasquez," he said. She looked at him. The high ground. Rocky shelf, northeast, approximately 1,100 meters. The left face of the sandstone overhang. She turned her eyes toward the gun port. She held them there for 4 seconds. "I saw it," she said, "when I came in. Then you know the angle." "Yes. I need it resolved." A pause. Not a long pause, 3 seconds, maybe 4. But in those seconds something moved across her face that was more readable than anything she had shown in 2 weeks at Kestrel. Not fear. Not reluctance. Something that looked like a person standing at a door they had decided not to open, watching someone else reach for the handle. "I'm support staff," she said. "Not right now, you're not," Holt said. Another pause. Dunn made a sound. Not a pain sound, just the sound of someone breathing deliberately, managing something. Elena looked at him. She looked at the medic, working on his shoulder. "That's an order," Holt said, quietly. "Final." While the radio traffic ran and the medic worked, and the afternoon light outside grew angular and orange-edged, Holt's aide was in the command post at the rear of the operations bay, with Elena's service record open on the terminal. The record existed in 2 layers. The outer layer was standard. Enlistment date, training completion, assignment history. The assignments were logistics posting, supply depot in Nevada, distribution center in Germany, FOB coordination in the Balkans. Unremarkable. The record of a competent support specialist with consistent efficiency ratings and no disciplinary flags. The aide almost closed it. Then he read the note his colonel had left. Check all versions. Archived records. Cross-reference program deletions. 2013, 2015. He knew what to look for because Holt had told him. He looked for the gaps. There were 2. An 8-month gap between her first and second assignment, 2013 to 2014, accounted for by a training attachment notation that referenced a unit designation that, when he searched the designation, returned no current results and no historical file under the standard classification. Just a 2-digit access code that he didn't have clearance for. And a single line at the bottom of the archived version of the record, not in the current version, only in the version time-stamped from an older database backup that read, "Program attachment concluded. Personnel reintegrated standard channels per Section 7 protocol." Section 7 protocole. The aide knew what that meant. Not specifically, he had no direct access to those files, but he knew the phrase, "the way you know the name of a room you've been told never to enter." Section 7 protocol was the administrative language for ending a program that officially didn't exist by returning its participants to roles that officially never referenced it. He wrote 3 words on a notepad and brought it to the colonel. The colonel read the 3 words. Ghost. Section 7. He folded the paper once, put it in his breast pocket, and walked back to where Elena was. He had been 31 years old when he first heard the name Ghost Sniper, had heard it as a rumor, then as a briefing point, then as a classified operational asset associated with a shadow program that ran for approximately 18 months before being quietly terminated, following an operation that had gone catastrophically wrong in a way that was never publicly characterized. The asset had not been killed. The record said reintegrated, which meant they had simply filed her somewhere else and closed the door. He had not known the asset's name. He had seen one photograph, grainy, taken from a distance, showing a figure in a ghillie suit prone on a ridgeline. The figure's hands, extending from the suit to grip the rifle stock, were the only distinguishing detail. The grip was unusual, the thumb positioned along the stock rather than wrapped beneath it. A specific adaptation for a specific hand geometry and a specific kind of hold. He had looked at Elena's hands when she was cleaning her weapon in the barracks. He had seen the thumb. He had been certain since 0730 that morning. The rifle she was given was the unit's long-range precision weapon, a system she had not touched since arriving at Kestrel, had not been assigned, had not requested. The armory sergeant brought it to the gunport position without ceremony and set it on the sandbag platform. She stood beside it for a moment, not touching it. Goss was 3 feet away. He saw her look at the rifle the way you look at something you used to own, recognizing it without claim. Then she crouched beside it and ran her right hand along the stock, not adjusting it, just touching it. A single pass. Thumb along the grip. There it was. The thumb position. He didn't say anything. He watched. She lay prone behind the weapon and drew it into her shoulder. The stock seated against her collarbone with a kind of inevitability. The way things fit when they were made for each other, or when they had been fitted over a long time. She pulled the bipod legs wider by 3 millimeters, not adjusting, correcting, as though she already knew what the standard setting was wrong by. The gun port gave her a field of view perhaps 12 degrees wide. The rocky shelf on the northeast high ground was at the far left edge of that field. The sandstone overhang was dark in the angular afternoon light. There was no visible movement. Whitfield was behind her and to the left. He looked at the ridge through his own scope and shook his head slightly. "Wind's running hard," he said. 45-degree crosswind at this range. You're going to need to hold off by... "I know," she said. He stopped talking. The room was not quiet. There was radio traffic. There was Dunn's controlled breathing from the far wall. There was the dry, rhythmic sweep of sand against the eastern face. But something happened to the quality of sound in the room when Elena Vasquez settled behind the weapon. Not silence. Something denser than silence. Something that happens when a group of people simultaneously realize they are watching something they don't fully understand. She did not use the scope immediately. She lay behind the weapon and looked over it, and her eyes did the same slow, measuring thing they had done when she arrived at Kestrel, that surveyor's examination. that reading of distances. She was not looking at the target. She was looking at what was between her and the target. The air itself. The heat shimmer, which had a particular character at this hour that was different from its midday character. The way the wind moved through the 2 clumps of dry scrub brush at the 400-meter mark, which gave her a real-time indicator of the air pattern at that layer. Her left hand came up and pressed lightly against the left side of her face, not covering her eye. Something else calibrating, perhaps, the way certain shooters use physical sensation to anchor their position. "Can't make that shot," Rourke said from behind. He said it quietly, not as criticism, just as a statement of physical fact. Wind and range together. Nobody shushed him, but the room's quality of attention shushed him anyway. Elena's cheek came down to the stock. Her eye found the scope. She was still. She did not fire quickly. This was the first thing that registered with everyone in the room. The time. She had been behind the weapon for 40 seconds. 60. The light outside was continuing its slow decline, and the shadows on the ridge were deepening, and nobody spoke because nobody wanted to be the sound that broke something. Goss had his eyes on the left side of her face, the only part of her he could see clearly from his angle. He watched it the way you watch a dial. Nothing changed in her face. He noticed her breathing. It was not the controlled, deliberate breathing of someone managing tension. It was slower than that. It was the breathing of someone who has set their entire physiological system to a lower frequency, not suppressed, not controlled, just reduced. He had read once about a cardiac measurement taken from a professional shooter at the moment of trigger pull. The heart rate, in the moment of the shot, had been 41 beats per minute. He believed it now. 90 seconds. The wind, which had been running from the southeast in gusts, dropped. For perhaps 3 seconds, the scrub brush at the 400-meter mark went still. Whitfield noticed the lull and opened his mouth. She fired. 1 round. The sound of it inside the confined space was sharp and complete. Then it was over. Then the room was the same temperature and the same dimensions and the same collection of people it had been before the shot, but something in it had shifted the way rooms shift after an event that cannot be categorized in real time. Nobody moved. Outside, at 1,112 meters, the distance Holt had measured on his arrival, walking the line of sight from the entrance to the northeastern ridge with a practiced eye, committing the number to memory before he entered the building, the sandstone overhang was still. 5 seconds. Rourke had a spotting scope at the second gun port. He was tracking the shelf. His hands were on the scope and his eye was at the eyepiece, and he was making no sound. 10 seconds. The radio on the operation table came alive. It was the reconnaissance element. The voice on the radio was a young man named Carver, who had been maintaining observation on the high ground position for the past 40 minutes, and who was not given to imprecision. "Position is down," Carver said. "1 shooter. Northeast shelf. I'm confirming." A pause. Confirmed. Single round impact. Another pause. "He was behind that overhang, I don't know how you." A longer pause. "He was behind the overhang. How did you?" Nobody answered him. In the room, Mercer looked at the back of Elena's head. He looked at her hands on the rifle. He looked at the way she was still lying behind it, not in the released posture of a shooter who has just fired, but in the same exact configuration she had been in before the shot, not moving, still measuring. Rourke pulled his eye away from the spotting scope. He turned around. He had the expression of a man who has done a calculation 3 times and gotten the same impossible result. "That was," he said, and stopped. He tried again. "That was a..." He didn't finish. There was no finish that wasn't redundant. Whitfield was very quiet. He had his hands in his pockets. He was looking at the floor. Goss looked at the rifle. He looked at Elena's hands. He thought about the cap she had retrieved, the geometry of the retrieval, the measured alteration of her path. He thought about the eyes on the ridgeline, the intervals of stillness, the surveyor's calculation that had been running since the day she arrived. He had known something. He hadn't known what. Now he knew what. Elena disengaged from the weapon slowly. She pulled back from the stock, came to her knees, stood in the clean, unhurried sequence of someone completing a task. She looked at the rifle once, not admiringly, not with any recoverable sentiment, and set it back on the sandbag platform. She turned toward the room. Dunn, from the far wall, was watching her. The medic was still working on his shoulder, but Dunn's head was turned and his eyes were clear and they were on Elena. He did not say anything. After a moment he gave a single nod, small, deliberate, the way you nod at something that is bigger than a nod, but that a nod is all you can offer. Elena looked at him. She nodded back. Colonel Holt crossed the room. He crossed it without urgency, at the same measured, contained pace with which he had crossed it before. But there was something in the crossing that was different from before, something in the angle of his posture, in the positioning of his shoulders, that the men registered without being able to name. He stopped in front of Elena Vasquez. He was taller than her by perhaps 6 inches. He stood at his full height, and then, without transition, without preamble, he came to attention. Full parade attention. Heels together, hands at the seams of his trousers, back straight, chin level, eyes forward. The room processed this one body at a time. Rourke saw it first, then Goss. Then, one by one, the others, the recognition traveling through the space the way cold travels through a building when a window is opened, not all at once, but inevitably. A colonel did not stand at attention before a specialist. This was not a social convention. It was a structural fact of military organization, as elemental as gravity. You did not reverse it casually. You did not reverse it by accident. When a colonel stood at attention before a specialist, it meant the specialist was not what the colonel was looking at. He was looking at something the rank did not contain. Holt held the position for 3 seconds. Then, without changing the angle of his chin or the level of his eyes, he said, "Welcome back, Ghost." The word moved through the room. Ghost. Whitfield's mouth opened slightly. He looked at Elena. He looked at the gun port. He looked at Rourke, who was looking at Elena, with the expression of someone recalculating from the beginning. Mercer did not move. He was standing by the operations table, and he was looking at the back of Holt's head and then at Elena's face, and he was doing the same thing Goss had done, running the previous 12 days through a new lens and arriving at the same conclusion Goss had arrived at, only faster, because he had more data. The folded blanket, the bore brush sequence, the cap retrieval, the assessment scores 300, 400, 500, all wrong by the same precise margin. The eyes on the ridgeline, the stillness. 12 days of a carefully constructed ordinariness. Elena looked at Holt. Her face remained what it had been, still, readable only in fragments, organized around a composure that was not performance. But something in her eyes shifted for a moment, something that was not quite acknowledgement, and not quite resignation, and not quite relief, but that contained elements of all three in proportions that were hers alone. She said nothing. After 3 seconds, Holt released from attention. He turned without additional ceremony and walked to the operations table. He picked up the radio. "Kestrel actual to reconnaissance," he said. "High ground is clear. Begin reassessment of the northern approach." "Copy, Kestrel," Carver's voice returned. A pause. "Colonel, that shot. What was?" "Reconnaissance élément. Focus on your task." "Doppe." Holt set the radio down. He looked at his aide, who was standing with a notepad and a carefully neutral expression. "Update the unit strength report," Holt said. "Support classification, Vasquez. Change the secondary designation." "To what, sir?" Holt looked across the room, to where Elena was crouching beside the sandbag platform, resetting the bipod legs of the precision rifle to their original position. "Leave it blank," he said. There was no celebration. This was perhaps the most significant thing about the aftermath, the absolute absence of the noise that should have accompanied it. No one whooped. No one clapped. No one sought her out with the loud, relieved congratulation that men offer each other after a crisis passes. There was only the change. It was the change in small behaviors. The change in the angle at which Rourke held his body when he passed her in the corridor. The change in the speed at which Whitfield looked away when she entered a room, not the slow, contemptuous look away of before, but the fast, involuntary look away of someone who has been made aware that they were seeing something incorrectly. Goss was the only one who made a direct gesture. He brought her a tin of coffee from the mess, not with any particular fanfare, just set it on the shelf above her bunk without comment, and walked away. She looked at the tin. She didn't say anything. That evening in the Western Barracks, Rourke was making his bunk before lights out. He had always made it adequately, the blanket flat, the corners roughly folded, the pillows centered. He had never thought about it more than that. He made it 3 times that night. The first time was the way he always made it. The second time he noticed the corner fold was uneven and smoothed it. The third time he folded the corner twice, tucking the edge underneath, pulling it taut at the angle he had watched Elena work that first morning in the heat. He stood back. He looked at it. It wasn't right, not the way hers was, not even close. He stood there for a moment longer than was necessary, and then he went to bed. Whitfield didn't make his bunk differently, but he was quieter than usual, and in his quietness there was something that was close to thinking, not processing the shot, not cataloging the range and the conditions and the wind, but thinking about the morning she arrived, and what he had said, and what she had said in return, and how much information had been contained in those 2 words. I know. She had known she was not in a hotel. She had known what she was and where she was and what she was capable of, and she had known all of it in a way that had nothing to do with comfort or luxury or the soft things his mockery had been pointing at. She had known it in a way that rendered his comment not insulting but simply incorrect, a misidentification, like calling a surgeon a janitor because they're both wearing white. He lay in his bunk and stared at the corrugated ceiling and said nothing out loud. Mercer found Holt in the command post at 2100, working through paperwork. He knocked on the door frame. Holt looked up. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted." Mercer stepped inside. He stood at a modified ease, not parade rest, not casual, somewhere professional in between. "I should have seen it sooner," he said. Holt looked at him. "Should you?" "The indicators were there. I was watching, and I wasn't seeing." "What were you seeing instead?" Mercer considered this. Someone who didn't fit. Holt set his pen down. He leaned back in his chair by a degree. "People who don't fit are the most important ones to look at twice," he said. "Not because they're threats. Because the ways they don't fit are usually the information." Mercer thought about this. What was the information, in this case? That she was using about 30% of her capacity and nobody was asking about the other 70. Holt picked up his pen again. "That's not her failure. That's an organizational failure. It happens constantly. We build systems to sort people into categories, and then we're confused when the categories don't contain them." Mercer didn't answer immediately. He was thinking about the 12 days, the assessed scores, the wrong wind correction, the ordinariness constructed as carefully as the muzzle position in the sandstone overhang. "Why didn't she just tell someone?" he said. Holt looked at him again. There was something in the look that was not quite patience and not quite understanding, but that contained both the look of someone who has held a question for a long time. "Because the last time she didn't hide," Holt said. "The program that built her used that against her. And then they closed the program and called it paperwork." He went back to his papers. "Get some sleep, Mercer." In the eastern barracks, at 2215, Elena Vasquez sat on the edge of her bunk in the dark. The base had settled into its nighttime rhythms, the perimeter check rotation, the low idling of the generator, the wind against the eastern wall doing its same dry, patient work. She reached for her blanket. She stood, shook it out, laid it flat across the mattress. She moved to the foot of the bunk and folded the corner, pressed the crease, folded again, pulled the edge tight, and tucked it under the frame. She stepped to the other corner, did the same. The blanket lay flat in the dark, its surface perfectly level, its corners at 45 degrees. She stood at the foot of the bunk and looked at it, not admiring, not assessing, just the particular look of a person who has done the same thing so many times that the doing of it has become indistinguishable from the self. A ritual that does not require witness, does not require approval, does not require anyone standing nearby to understand what it means, or to recognize what it signals about the person performing it. She sat back down on the edge of the bunk. From 2 bunks away, she could hear Goss's steady breathing. He was already asleep. On the shelf above his bunk, his patrol cap was positioned the same way it was every night. Not squared, not precise, just resting. The way things rest when they don't carry weight. She looked at her own shelf, the canteen, the toiletry bag, aligned at their edges, the way she had placed them on the first morning. She had known, that morning, that someone would come who would understand. She had not known it would take 12 days. She had not known it would be Holt. Though a kernel made sense, only certain people held the institutional memory required to read what she showed. She had known it would happen because it always happened. The long patience, and then the moment. The waiting out of all the noise, and then the clarity on the other side of the noise. The same way a shot happens, not in the pulling, but in everything that comes before the pulling. The breath, the hold, the reading of the air. She lay down on the blanket on top of it, still dressed, as was her habit, in a forward position, and looked at the corrugated ceiling. Outside, the wind was running southeast now, at a lower speed than it had run all day. She had been tracking it by sound. Somewhere beyond the perimeter, the scrub brush was doing its real-time calculations, registering the change, bending in the new direction. 1,100 meters was not her longest shot. It wasn't close. But it was the one that counted tonight. And tonight was the only tonight there was. And in the morning there would be new wind and new angles and new distances, and she would read them all before anyone asked her to. She closed her eyes. She did not fold her hands on her chest the way people do in movies when they are meant to look peaceful. She put one arm along her side and one under her head, and she breathed the way she breathed when she was behind the weapon, slowly, completely, at a frequency the room had no name for. In the morning, her bunk would be made. It was already made. No one would say anything about it. No one would need to.